Alrighty, good evening, families. We'll give folks a minute to get into the webinar and then we'll get started. Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get started. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Family Sports Series. My name is Kayla Tingley. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the graduate assistant for family programs, and I'll be moderating tonight. Um, and tonight we're joined by campus partners from Disability Services. They'll be discussing different accommodations and just resources that your students can take advantage of. They'll answer pre-written questions as well as any questions you may have. Tonight, while they're speaking, feel free to use the Q&A button, not the chat button at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. The chat button will be used to show different information and resources and things like that. We also have live transcripts and closed captioning for those who may need it. And this session will be recorded and posted to our website and YouTube channel. Alrighty, I'm gonna hand it over to the family team to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maria Doherty. I'm one of the Access Consultants in the Office of Disability Services.
Hi, everyone. My name is Deidre Lamb, and I'm also an Access Consultant, Disability Services.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gentry Smith. I'm the Administrative Assistant for Disability Services, and I believe Camille will be next to introduce herself.
Good evening, families. My name is Camille Clark. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Associate Director of Family Programs in the Office of New Student and Family Programs.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mackenzie Nelson. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Assistant Director of Family Programs.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Karen. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the family coordinator for family programs.
Alrighty, and I'll hand it over to Maria to get started.
Thanks, everybody. And we're so happy that you can join us here today. So we're going to go through, Deidre and I are going to go through, I'm really quickly going to make sure that I can flip through my slides. We just want to take a quick minute to acknowledge who's here today, who might be in our office, or might be wanting to connect with our office. So some of you might be either a student themselves, a Mason student, or perhaps you're a family member of a student who has an established disability. Maybe you had an IEP plan or a 504 plan in high school, and so you're really wanting to just learn more about our office and how to get connected. You also might just be somebody who is looking to get more information about campus, which is wonderful. And just to hear generally about George Mason resources that are available. So we'll be happy to, give you some general information as well, because maybe will become relevant to your life through your Mason journey. And so really happy that you're able to connect with us today. Just to cover, go over the topics we will be covering. So we'll be reviewing some background and data. We love data in our office and want to give you guys context for the work that we do, as well as our role in the college environment and what that looks like and why kind of we exist and why we're here. Then we will get into the stuff that maybe some of you are looking specifically for, talking about connecting specifically with our office and how to do that. And then we are going to take some time to cover some resources and programs that are associated with our office as well. Just a quick note on language, and we kind of share this in all of our presentations. So you'll notice that Deidre, Gentry, and I are going back and forth between using what's referred to as person first language and identity first language. And that's because the disability community at large, a lot of individuals have their own preferences about ways that they want to be referred to when it comes to their diagnosis or disability. So to respect everybody, we're going to switch back and forth throughout our presentation today. So you might notice that as well. Take it away, Deidre.
Okay. Thank you, Maria. Okay, so we're going to just start from the beginning. What is a disability? And so for in our world, we frame it is that the ADA, under the ADA, a student must have a disability in order to be affiliated with the Disability Service Office. And what are those aspects that we look at? That it substantially limits one or more major life activities. And in this context, in this environment, it could be learning, it could be getting access to a particular building, for example. It could be an individual who has a history of disability, or an individual has a record of such impairment. And a person can be perceived as having a disability, meaning that the way a person might interact with the environment, someone might refer an individual to our office. And one of the things that we do really like to debunk is that the ADA does not specifically name impairments. We're really looking at the environment and how a student enters the environment, how they interact with the environment, and what are those barriers that each individual student may be having. So we really treat the student as an individual and really listen to what their barriers are. So the numbers are growing in the United States of students affiliating with disability services across the country. Approximately 1 in 4 individuals overall in the United States have a disability. And it can be a permanent disability, it can be a temporary disability. Um, and we don't really look at that data so much, is that we look at the data, who's affiliating with us at the university. And so currently, the most current data we have from 2020 to 2021 is 21% of undergraduates and 11% of post-baccalaureate uh, students have disabilities. And students can affiliate it with us at any time, either at the beginning of their journey in post-secondary or at the end, or when they have a particular barrier. So a student can have or identify as an individual with a disability and not use accommodations or seek accommodations until they encounter a barrier, and that's okay too. Students have choices. So at George Mason, there are 3 top categories of students who affiliate with us, and that would be attention deficit disorders or ADHD, psychological disabilities. An example would be depression, um, and then medical. And that could be anywhere from, someone has broken a wrist, so it could be temporary, or they could have longer or more notable medical disabilities. And students have multiple disabilities. So they could have a learning disability and they've had a temporary disability at the same time. But we work with the student individually to to determine what those barriers are and remove them. In 2026, close to 4,000 students affiliated with disability services, and the number is growing. So disability services in the college environment. So we're going to talk about like really what frames our work. And There are several laws that frame our work, and such as the Americans with Disability Act, Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and we also want to protect confidentiality. And we really like to not focus so much on the laws when we have presentations because it just sits in the background. We know that they're there. We know that we have to adhere to compliance. But the other point in the slide that says protect confidentiality is one of the most important aspects of our work. So when we reach out to faculty or other staff members on campus, we're going to frame our conversations around what is the barrier that the student is experiencing and what are we looking to remove. We're not going to talk about what the student's disability is. That's up to the student. The student can disclose that if they choose, but it will not be our role to do so. We also, as we're looking at the environment, we're also looking at how to permanently remove barriers in the environment. So that would be in the classroom and in the built environment. And I'm sorry, universal design for learning is one of those constructs that we look at. And so we're looking at how everybody has access, disabled or non-disabled, to the classroom, to the curriculum, and how can these things be designed for everybody to enter into those spaces curricularly or in a built environment without having to ask for an accommodation. That's the bar that we want to set. We're not always there, but we strive to have that lens and have that um, goal for our environment. We also work with faculty. We do trainings with faculty and staff on best practices for accessibility. And and again, we want to know from their perspective what is what are their barriers to providing that equal access for the campus community, and particularly in this context, students. We also support students throughout their journey. So once you're affiliated with disability services and you're affiliated, you have access to your accommodations, but you may not be using them. That's okay. You can come back and ask for assistance at any time. But we do work with individualized accommodation plans. When we first meet with a student, we talk to them again, what are their requests, what are their barriers, and we put a plan in place. We also talk to students about how to be self-advocates, how to not only share the information about what their accommodations are, but about how they want to use those accommodations or when they're going to use those accommodations and open up that dialogue with professors because after all those are the folks that has created the curriculum. um, but we're available to assist students always with those conversations. But we also want students to we want to empower students to make their own choices. So we don't ever require that students use their accommodations. So from semester to semester, students can choose to use their accommodations or not, and then communicate that with their faculty. And we provide accommodations. We provide accommodations in the curricular environment. So for courses, if a student is attending a seminar that's being given on the campus and they need accommodations, if a student is coming to visit for orientation and they need accommodations, we will work to make sure that they are accommodated. Um, and then so then we also coordinate accommodations across campus. So if, for example, if there's a presentation at large for the entire campus community and and an individual students and staff and faculty alike, we make sure that there's sign language interpreters, that there is captioning for presentations like this. And so we do want our campus community to be as inclusive as possible. And then we also monitor accommodation issues. So once we meet with a student, we're not going to always know what's happening with the student unless they tell us. But if we know that there could be some roadblocks, we're going to absolutely monitor that proactively. But that is why we always encourage students, empower students to communicate with us when they're encountering a barrier, so we can assist. Um, I also want to emphasize, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in a little bit, about what accommodations can and cannot do. And accommodations can't fundamentally alter the nature of a course or a program or a service. And what that means is when a faculty or a group of people come together to put together a program, they do it with intention to, you're going to learn this information. I want you to do this work. I'm going to give you an exam so you can demonstrate your knowledge. So accommodations can't change the overarching goal of why something was created. So we want to be able to modify it or provide some accommodations that provides equal access but doesn't change the purpose from the outset. So just to get into the federal regulations on disability, I'm just going to touch on them because again, we don't want to overly emphasize it. We don't, when we meet with a professor, for example, we're not going to say, well, we're going to talk about the XYZ laws today. That sits in our background. We're going to lead with these are the barriers, these are the things that we believe with the information that we have that will effectively remove the barrier, and we want to put in an accommodation in place so the student can just be a student. And so the first one is the Americans with Disabilities Act and its amendments, and it applies broadly to public institutions like GMU. So anytime a institution um, receives funds for students, then that's kind of the hallmark of like we do need to provide access. Section 504 of the Rehab Act um, it applies to institutions that receive federal funding, so which includes all colleges and universities. And I think I just got that mixed up. It's the 504 that requires that's the hallmark of having that funding from federal. Um, and then the other act is the Fair Housing Act, and that act really governs housing accommodations and how we implement them and why we implement them. So, to support equal access, institutions are required to provide reasonable accommodations across the board. So, I have to say, I really like this slide and I like this information in terms of this is really a great way to frame the differences between prior. So if you have a student that's used accommodations in high school, um, providing this information about how it really looks different in college is important because it can really set the student expectations for what their experience is going to be like working with our department. So in high school, overall, accommodations are put in place so a student can be successful, meaning the goal is the student is going to graduate from high school. And how are we going to put accommodations in place? And what are those accommodations that's going to allow a student to be successful? So in high school, IEPs, individualized education programs, it's framed in the least restrictive environment, which means that they're going to remove all the barriers. So they're going to modify classes. They're going to put some accommodations in place that you will not see in the college environment. So some examples are grades go to parents because students are no, they're not 18 yet. So, parents are in charge, of course, right? So they get the main communication. So grades go to parents. Teachers facilitate the accommodations. Um, Homework is due the next class, which is very different from college. In college, it could be 3 weeks from now or at the end of the semester. So we see often in IEPs that there are some modifications to this particular aspect of assignments and giving um, extensions, for example. In high school, the student and the parent mainly communicates with the school and the teachers. The student, as they get older, are invited to IEP meetings and is really encouraged. In college, parents are invited by the student, and so their students are not required to have their parents in meetings with us. Um, and teachers contact parents and they give reports on how their student is doing. That does not happen in college. And the biggest difference and change for students from high school to college is that they have a consistent daily schedule. The school day starts at a particular time, ends on a particular time, 5 days a week. They can spread out the work because they're in class every day. Whereas in college, they might go to a particular class twice a week or once a week. So the schedule's very, very different. Some would say perhaps not as rigorous, but it's a change. And that's what we focus on. It's a change for the student. They're used to a particular way of working in their high school environment and so we know that transition is not always a smooth one, but we do want to make it smoother. Um, so the main differences at college is we provide access, which is very different from success. But access doesn't mean that we don't want students to be successful because everything that we do at GMU, at disability services, at all support services on campus that are designed to support students is we want them to be successful. But for us at Disability Services, it's a two-pronged. We want them to be successful, but we also have to provide access. So in college, students are going to self-disclose. And I talked a little bit about that at the beginning because parents can't disclose. We can't disclose to students' disability. The student facilitates accommodations. And that means the student is responsible for informing their professors by way of an accommodation letter, and it outlines their accommodations. If a student doesn't share that with their professors, then they don't exist in the professor's mind because as soon as a student shares that information with their professors, it activates their accommodations for that semester. Um, Students' information about grades go directly to the student, and if a student wants to make sure their parents have that information, then they can work that out internally and have conversations about how that's going to look. Um, Students have a consistent weekly schedule, but not a daily schedule, because as I mentioned, they could have a variety of classes on one day and have no classes on a Thursday, for example. Um, we see students as adults, so they might be just entering the age of 18 or maybe a little bit younger when they enter college, but we treat all the students as adults and they are in charge of their personal information. um, Parents can support and we always welcome parents to be in our meetings, but the main person that we're going to be talking to is your student because we want to understand their barrier. And there's a variety of due dates. And every syllabus, syllabus is an outline of what the expectations are and what's the schedule for this particular class. And so that's also something different that the student has to get used to, that every semester it's going to look different and there's going to be different expectations for what professors want to see. And professors contact students directly. And so that's different too. And so we do support students and what does that look like? And and not to be um, fearful of a professor because professors are just like all of us. They're human, but they might have a question about like how can I help you? I have thank you for your academic accommodation letter. Let me know how I can support you. And so we do talk to students about how to respond um, to their faculty.
Absolutely. Thanks, Deidre. And that
Welcome.
kind of leads us into this next section, connecting with disability services. That leads us perfectly. And I won't spend too much time on it because Deidre just really perfectly encapsulated what that looks like. I know students in our audience tonight have had at least a year probably of practicing this skill. We are in the kind of final stretch of spring semester. I know it doesn't quite feel like it yet, but we're getting real close, gang, I promise. So many of you who are in our audience today have had, all of fall, maybe even though earlier than that, right? Self-advocacy is a big word that even folks start talking about in their junior and senior year of high school, and we totally understand that. But it really is, right? And the reason why we hit it again is just it's so important in college. So, and you've probably maybe if you've attended multiple of these sessions, you've heard other support resources talking about that skill of just starting to kind of self-reflect and developing those muscles of identifying what do you need in this moment, but then what do you need in general in order to help support you and help you be successful as a student. Asking for help, which is so hard for many, many of us, whether or not you carry a diagnosis or have a disability or not, asking for help is not the easiest. Seeking out the resources that you need. And I would bet that if you're a student in the audience tonight and you're attending these sessions, you're already taking the first steps to that. That's why the lovely folks at Family Programs are holding these sessions, is so you can find information about these resources. Reaching out to us, of course, is part of that. So exploring those reasonable accommodations, taking the initiative and communicating with your professors, like Deidre was just talking about, attending their office hours, even though that can sometimes feel scary because kind of the one-on-one aspect of that can feel tough versus just kind of being in the crowd of your class where you're kind of one of multiple asking questions, and maintaining that open communication is good, not only with your faculty members and your disability service access consultant, but also your parents and your family supports at home, right? Because those are your number one supporters and advocates who are rooting you on in your journey. And just in general, as we all are, doing the best you can is a really big part of that. And as many of you know, probably at this point, students should not kind of just assume that someone will reach out if you're not doing well, or maybe not the best idea to wait all the way until the end of the semester when finals are 2 days away and we're feeling that panicked feeling to reach out for help, because oftentimes the time limitation is not going to be quite what everybody needs in order to support you the most effectively. Don't stop attending your classes just in general, even if it feels hard to do without communicating what that's looking like with your faculty members or your support network on campus and off campus. Really avoid that temptation to have, parents or anybody else email faculty on your behalf. That self-disclosure, on our end specifically is a really big deal. And so students really are responsible and in charge of doing that. And this might be a little bit controversial, but giving login information to your parents or things like that just kind of automatically is not the most encouraged, at least from our office, because we do really sit and very firmly in that place of students are adults and kind of need to be managing their own information. So there's just, again, just kind of covering those skills and what that looks like, which brings us into the process of connecting with us, because the very first step, as we've mentioned, is the student does need to self-disclose with us, and needs to identify as having a disability and wanting to use accommodations in our services is step number one. So they need to come to us. Even if we get maybe a referral from a faculty member who said, I had a conversation with this student who shared with me this thing, that doesn't always mean that we can take action on that until the student themselves comes to us, even if they openly shared with their faculty member. The student really does need to come to us themselves to initiate the process. So that's step number one. And then we'll kind of go down the left side of this slide with the green arrows first. So student submits, we have an initial form. We call it the student self-identification form with, it has kind of your basic information on it. So we get your name, of course, your G number, what year you are in college, because again, anybody can connect with us at any time in their journey at Mason. So maybe you're a first year, but maybe you decide you don't need us until your junior year. So we just kind of like to get an idea of where you are in your program and your journey. And on that form, also, we're going to ask for a little bit of initial information about what are your diagnoses? How does that impact you, or is it currently impacting you? Have you ever used accommodations before, either in high school or maybe even at a different school, right? We have plenty of transfer students who are joining us from Nova Community College or other colleges and universities around the state of Virginia and the nation. So we want to know, have you connected with those disability services offices? Because that's a really great, jumping off point for us as well, just to kind of get an idea of where you are at and what you have used before. So that's that student self-identification form. And then also we ask students to submit appropriate documentation of disability alongside that form. So things like that could include might be your IEP or 504 plan from high school. Even, of course, if it's, expired because you graduated from high school, still having that knowledge of that you had the IEP and 504 and what accommodations were included in that is really helpful. And of course, establishes that a student did have, a disability at that time. But that's just one example. We'll go on the next couple of slides, we'll dive in deeper into that documentation piece. So just hang tight on that really quickly. So after we get that initial documentation and those initial forms, what is going to happen, and the reason why it's great that we have Gentry here as well, is our front office is going to work with you to schedule we call it an initial meeting or an intake meeting with an access consultant. So either myself or Deidre or one of our colleagues in the office to have a conversation about all of those things that you kind of put on your identification form. But also we really want to hear about from your perspective, right? This is the biggest important part of what's going on right now. What are the challenges and barriers that you're experiencing in the college environment? Is it in your classes? Is it something going on in housing that we need to talk about a housing accommodation? And really want to hear from you in real time and have that conversation about what's going on. Talking about approving your accommodations and talking about next steps. So oftentimes that's where we'll really also give a deep dive into, the academic accommodation letter and disclosure to a professor and how that all works, right? We'll cover that in the intake meeting as well. So most times for academic accommodations, students walk out of those intake meetings knowing most of what their accommodations will be. And sometimes access consultants need to take a little bit of time and do some research or contact a faculty member to learn about what that course structure is or why they give a test in the way that they give the test, because professors are all different as well. But most of the time, students kind of have a good idea coming out of that intake meeting of the direction that you're headed in terms of the accommodations that you'll have in college. So on the right side of my slide here, it just kind of important points that we've already kind of talked about. The first one being the student is the driver in this process. They are considered an adult. And so they really do have to be the one to participate in what we call the interactive process, which is that back and forth, that conversation about barriers and what accommodations are needed and can be approved. And then, of course, if the student agrees, we welcome, parents providing support or family members in general providing support. Sometimes it's really helpful for parents to give context of what some of those early days are, especially if somebody's had a diagnosis or a disability for a while and they can't quite remember from their childhood what that looked like and what was useful. So absolutely that can be helpful, but with student permission. We advocate for the student as needed, especially in conversations with faculty members who might have questions about what an accommodation is. Faculty definitely are great partners for us, but sometimes it's new to them as well. They're not always the expert on every single accommodation. That's why you have access consultants and disability services in general. So we're there to also act as somebody who's answering those questions and is an advocate for what the students' access needs are. And then the last point, just in general, we've talked about this, the student, as things go along after accommodations are approved, need to really continue to reach out to us and keep in contact with us as things come up, or if they have a concern. I joke with a lot of my students that I work with that at some point in my life, I will become a mind reader. I am committed to that. Unfortunately, I'm not quite there yet, y'all. So you gotta let me know when something's going on. Otherwise, I can't help. So really going back to that self-advocacy skill there. So that's our overarching process. So let's dive into, I promised we would dive a little bit deeper into the documentation aspect of that because this is something that is maybe a little bit different for folks. So just wanting to provide some further guidelines around what that looks like. So acceptable documentation includes a lot. It's actually a pretty wide range of what we could potentially look at. So one of the most common though being, and we've already mentioned it multiple times, is that IEP or 504 plan that a student may have had in high school, and maybe some members of our audience had that, and that's familiar to them. However, sometimes we might ask for a little bit more information if that IEP is older, maybe if it was something from middle school or maybe even freshman year of high school, or if it lacks detail. Sometimes we'll get just 1 or 2 pages of the IEP, but it's actually really helpful to have it in its full form so we can get those details of what was provided, what was needed at that time, and what accommodations were established in the K-12 environment. Military or state disability documentation is absolutely something that we can accept. We have a great veteran population at Mason who come to us after completing their years of service. And if they have received a disability diagnosis through the VA or from the result of their service, we are absolutely able to accept that as documentation. Other appropriate records as needed, and that also can include medical or psychological evaluations, or even psychoeducational, right? When maybe for our younger students, if you were meeting with a school psychologist in middle school or high school and have some of those reports or narratives that were written up by your school psychologist, that can be helpful. Otherwise, like statements or essentially doctor's notes from qualified healthcare providers or the members of your medical or mental health team, especially if they have a relationship with you and you've seen them for sometimes it's years that you've had a relationship with your provider. And so they have a really good basis of knowledge around what your kind of medical history has been. That's perfectly fine. We do have we call it the disability determination form. It is available on our website. So for instance, if a family doesn't necessarily have, any of those records that I've mentioned on file, or they've been lost for some reason or through some event or circumstance, they can go and you can download that, we call it the DDF for short, but disability determination form, and have your current doctor or provider fill it out. And that kind of just is it's our catch-all for what is this individual experiencing, what is maybe a little bit of their medical history to kind of give us that insight. And it provides that documentation of a diagnosed disability. So just in general, documentation, like overall, should be from a qualified professional. And that can be, like I talked about, a medical health provider, a medical provider in general, like a doctor. But a qualified professional also includes education professionals, school psychologists, and things of that nature. So it needs to be from a qualified professional, include credentials in their contact info, and or be on an official letterhead, just to kind of so we know that it is, a legitimate piece of documentation of disability. It is also possible that this is our initial documentation that we need in order to set up an appointment and get connected with our office. But based on the nature of a request, we may ask for additional documentation just so we can learn more about what that nature and what the impairment is behind the request. And we can connect what the student's experience is with something that has been provided by a medical provider. So sometimes we do, after that intake meeting, say, hey, I'm hearing this. I get what you're saying, but I do need to see, an additional piece of documentation that speaks to it. So we may ask for that after the intake appointment, but we'll give guidance as needed in those situations. It is important to note, especially in relation to the IEP and 504 plans, that the accommodations that are listed on those plans don't automatically transfer. We're not going to do an automatic copy paste to the college environment accommodations realm. I think, Deidre touched on it before. Some accommodations don't really exist in the college environment. And oftentimes an example I give that we often see on IEP plans is teacher checks for understanding is a one that you might see on there. That's considered a success-based accommodation that you might see on an IEP, but because of the change and the transition to the college environment and our access-based perspective, it actually is the student that becomes responsible for checking their understanding by going and asking questions to their professor and visiting office hours. So that's not generally an accommodation that we would be able to provide. And that's just one example. But that, again, is part of that interactive process where we're talking through those differences and those things and helping to explain that to a student, especially if they're newer or if that transition, they're still early in the high school to college transition. So in general, we've spoken about this a lot, but what types of accommodations are even available? In broad category, we are talking a lot about academic accommodations. And I think most people, when they think about disability services, they're thinking in that general realm. That's just kind of what tends to spring to the front of people's minds when we're talking about accommodations is the academic accommodations. That could include classroom accommodations, testing accommodations, anything in that realm, right? But we also mentioned before, especially related to that Fair Housing Act that we talked about when we are discussing our regulation guidances, we do provide housing accommodations. We are a university that has campus residential options, so we provide housing accommodations. That might be something like a single room accommodation, an emotional support animal, things like that fall under the umbrella of housing accommodations. And then we do provide dining or meal plan accommodations as well. So if somebody has a grand number of food intolerances or cannot, eat or they are impaired in the area of eating and food, we are able to take a look at that with that student, oftentimes in partnership with our campus dietitian, to take a look at what are appropriate ways to give the student access to appropriate nutrition in our campus environment. So that's something that we talk about as well. And again, and we said it before, I'll say it again, approved accommodations are unique to each student. We are evaluating all of these requests on an individual to individual basis. So one student who comes to me with an ADHD diagnosis is not necessarily going to get the same accommodations as, the person before them with an ADHD diagnosis. Everybody's an individual, which is why we really emphasize the importance of that self-advocacy and having those conversations with us so we can make sure that we know exactly what you need in order to have access. So let's just talk a little bit. This is our last section before Q&A, just about some associated services, resources, and programs that you might hear about related to disability services at George Mason specifically. So the first couple are our resources. So these are available if a student is approved for a certain type of accommodations, or maybe it's available by a referral from us and from our office. The first one being the Disability Services Testing Center. So we do have a testing center on the Fairfax campus. It's not on any of the satellite campuses. We haven't migrated to our satellite campuses just yet. It is a support for faculty and students with testing accommodations. Option one, if a faculty member is able to and prefers to proctor an exam with the student's approved accommodations, that's option one. Oftentimes, that's not very feasible, right? Student schedules are variable, professors are very busy because they teach multiple classes, and so they might not be able to make it happen. And if that's the case, then the student and the professor can work together to essentially reserve a spot at our testing center for their test or exam date so they can come take the test with us and guarantee that they will have their accommodations in that space. But it does require that coordination between student and professor to figure out what is the nature of the test, what accommodations do we need for this to put in place for this test, because again, remember, the student is in charge of deciding when they use their approved accommodations, even if they do have accommodations, and then reaching out to the testing center to get that scheduled. Like I mentioned, it's located on the Fairfax campus, and we operate Monday through Friday, is how that works. We also have the service Patriot Lift. So this is a referral-based service. It is essentially it's a shuttle service for students with mobility impairments or just mobility needs. So we can refer to them for a pickup from maybe a parking lot. We know that Fairfax especially is a rather large campus, and so if you're parking all the way out in lot K or J and you need to come into center campus for a class, that can be a really long, hard walk for our folks who already are having difficulty walking and with movement. So then that might be something where we take a look at Patriot Lift. Again, it operates on the Fairfax campus Monday through Friday and is available for referral after meeting with the Disability Service Access Consultant. And then these are our fee-based programs associated with disability services at GMU. And maybe some of you have even heard about these programs because oftentimes our staff who run these programs might have come into your high school, or you might have attended a table fair where they were present. So maybe some of these are familiar. The first one is the Mason Autism Support Initiative, and we call it MASSI. So this, as the name suggests, is for our students who are autistic or have an autism diagnosis. So it provides a more intensive support services beyond just typical academic or housing accommodations. It's a team-based approach to assist students achieving their goals in college and is available for students at any point in their Mason journey as long as they have, an autism diagnosis. Things that come with this program include a peer mentor that you meet with on a weekly basis, access to a learning strategist who, again, you meet with multiple times a week to kind of help organize and understand learning and organize your time and your learning objectives in all of your courses. There are skill building classes that the Massey students are enrolled in that they take together to learn about orienting to the college environment and just building up skills that are needed in higher education. And then also we hold monthly social events that are different themed. Sometimes they're movie nights, sometimes they're game nights, just so we can be together in community where our Massey students are, of course, invited. It's kind of a drop in, drop out as you want to come. Our peer mentors come, so they're also engaging as familiar faces, and it's just a time to be together, to have some fun and to relax. As I mentioned, it is a fee-based service, so applications, I believe, are still currently open for next academic year, the 26-27 academic year, and for the full year, the fee is $7,200. So if you have more interest in that or want to learn more, feel free to go to our website, the Disability Services website, and go to the Massey Information tab, or you can just Google the Mason Autism Support Initiative and it'll pop right up for you. The second fee-based service that we offer is called the Executive Functioning Support Program or the Executive Functioning Program, also kind of shortened down to EFP. This is for students not necessarily just with an autism diagnosis, but any diagnosis that creates a need to help support executive functioning skills. So think about your organization and your time management and staying on top of moving deadlines and following up with professors and emails and helping manage in those areas. So that program involves weekly meetings with a learning coach, and that's up to 3 hours a week or 3 meetings a week, but students can choose between 1, 2, or 3 hours. And those meetings with your learning coach are meant to develop skills in those, what I was mentioning, time management, organization, building up those goals and self-advocacy skills that we've talked so much about, and just your general independence. So you can maybe feel a little bit more comfortable moving in the college environment with a little bit extra support. So again, the full program, which is a 2 semester program, for 26, 27, applications are still very much open for EFP. I know that for sure. And the fees for next academic year is $4,000 for the 2 semesters. EFP also maintains a wait list, I believe, of up to 40 or 50 students. So even if if you don't get your application in time, or maybe you kind of just missed the cutoff, they will keep a wait list. So if somebody maybe drops out of EFP or decides not to continue for any reason, then they'll contact kind of the next people and they kind of keep that running as well. So that is Massey and EFP in brief, very short version for those two. Okay, everybody, we just covered so much information. I see we have about 9 minutes left, but are entering our question and answer portion. I know also that Kayla mentioned that we had some prepared questions that folks submitted before our webinar tonight. So let's jump right in. And I'm also, while we're answering questions, I'm going to put up our contact information slide. If you have a specific question about either your circumstance as a student, or maybe you're a parent of a student with a diagnosis or a disability that you want to talk very specifically about, we actually ask that maybe you hold your question and just reach out directly to us in the coming days or weeks so we can work through those things with you directly and talk very specifically about your circumstance, because we want to make sure that we're able to dedicate the time that you need to answer those very specific questions. But anything else, please, feel free to either put it in chat, raise your hand, and we're happy to cover it together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Just as a reminder, place your questions at the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You actually covered a lot of our pre-written questions, so thank you so much for that. You guys are definitely on it. First question is, there's a volunteer note taker sign up on your website. How do the students that are using the resources you all provide benefit from those notes? How can students get involved in that program? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Deidre, do you want to cover note takers?
Yes, I can do that. So note taking is one type of accommodation that provides access to lecture content for those students that can't take notes for themselves. And so when we work with a student on identifying the most effective way to obtain lecture content for some individual students, it might be the use of a peer note taker. Um, and so when a student is approved for a note taker for the classroom to obtain lecture content, it's usually done by a peer. And so we will send out information to the classroom and or faculty that we're seeking a volunteer peer note taker. And so specifically, how does it benefit a student? Well, it provides student that access to that lecture content. Um, and we always believe that no one takes better notes than the person that's taking the notes themselves. So we would always want depending on the student's access to that lecture content to be as engaged as they would be as if they were taking their own notes. So when a student volunteers to take notes, we will work with them on the side to give them all the information they need to be able to provide. We could provide them a packet of information so they can seamlessly upload their notes so we can provide those to the student. So the student who's using the accommodation is not in the weeds of trying, they're not querying the student to get those notes. It's really our role. So anything, and that just goes to a larger aspect of our role in implementing accommodations. We don't put more barriers in place for students to access their accommodations. We're going to seamlessly work behind the scenes um, to be able to provide that for students. And we recognize that there are times it's difficult to find note taking, peer note takers, because often peers have a lot of questions about that. What does it mean? Who's going to see them? And so we do work with the peer note takers to allay any of those fears that they might have, that they would be identified as an individual taking the notes for a student.
Alrighty, thank you. Um, Next we'll do one more question. You kind of talked about one of your missions is to kind of foster that relationship between students using accommodations and the greater campus community. So how do you help students build those relationships, whether it be finding a job on campus or making connections outside of folks in if they're involved in one of the programs and things like that? Like, how do you help students connect with the greater George Mason community?
Do you want me to go ahead and take it, Maria? Do you want to take it?
Sure, sure. Or I'll add in because I have some
Okay.
ideas as well. But
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So when we first, it depends on who's coming to see us, right? So if it's a freshman or if it's a student that's already connected, right? So I'm going to focus on, uh, not necessarily always a first year student, but the newer affiliated student to the university. And so when we first meet with a student, we're going to ask about their experiences. Again, what are their disability related barriers? And sometimes the disability related barriers kind of goes into that social aspect, right? That they may not feel as connected for a variety of reasons. They feel that they have to work so much harder because they're an individual with a disability. So they don't have time to seek out those social uh, uh, avenues or make new friends. And so we will make suggestions to students. We'll provide just information in general about how to connect. What are those things that students can do to help them feel connected? Because we also believe that those connections are really important to feel included and welcome, because that's, and we didn't really talk a lot about that, but from our first outreach, our first response to a student, to any time a student reaches out to us, we're going to treat them as if we haven't met with someone multiple times a day, or
Mhm.
answered many questions via email. So we do want to listen and provide them those resources and campus connections. So we might reach out to a campus partner just to say, hey, I'm going to connect you with a student. So then that campus partner has an idea of what to expect and who they're going to get a referral from. So we'll make those types of connections for student. Did you have things to add, Maria?
Yeah, I think you covered it, Deidre. I was gonna say also we even if we are not maybe the folks who have all the answers, we are often going to work really closely with the student to either I might say, hey, I'm going to figure this out for you and reach back out with a contact for you to connect with. Or say, hey, I have this great, colleague over in learning services. Her name is Vicky. She really helps with academic coaching. And let me tell you what this is. So talking through what those various resources are that can be also added as a support, because college in general can feel really decentralized and where you're getting the supports for everything. There's tutoring, there's learning services, there's disability services, there's career services, all of these wonderful things that you're learning about through these info sessions. but that's why we have all these info sessions. So making sure that we are operating as much as we can within the limits of confidentiality, right? As a network. And so a student can say, hey, I have Maria in my back pocket. She's my access consultant. And if I have a question, I at least know I can reach out to her and see if she can help me figure it out. Is really important to me and I think to us as a department. I also want to highlight just in general what we have. This is not something that I added on the resources slide, but I'm reflecting I maybe should have. We also have an honor society that is connected with us. It's called Delta Alpha Pi. We just had our induction ceremony earlier this spring in February. Shout outs again to Gentry because he helped plan and organize all of it. He's kind of like the perfect guy to connect with today. He's been working hard to answer all your questions in the chat. So thanks, Gentry. But Delta Alpha Pi is again an honor society for the students who are registered with our office, have a disability, and are participating in an honor society as well, which is another connection point. Again, right? All of these things can feel really overwhelming in college in general to find your people and to find your community. So as much as we can to provide these things, even if maybe it is just a warm handoff to our colleagues in another department to help a student feel like they're building their Mason support network is really important.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. It was awesome to just hear all of the ways that you're supporting students. I know they appreciate it, and our families and supporters do as well.
Absolutely.
So that is all the questions we have. Thank you again for all the support you provide. And as a reminder, this Family Sports series was recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next 2 weeks. So thank you again and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.